Wisdom presents My Brief History by Stephen Hawkins. Chapter 1. Childhood. My father, Frank, came from a line of tenant farmers in Yorkshire, England. His grandfather, my great-grandfather, John Hawking, had been a wealthy farmer, but he had bought too many farms and had gone bankrupt in the agricultural depression at the beginning of 20th century. His son, Robert, my grandfather, tried to help his father but went bankrupt himself. Fortunately, Robert's wife owned a house in Boroughbridge in which she ran a school, and this brought in a small amount of income. They thus managed to send their son to Oxford, where he studied medicine. My father owned a series of scholarships and prizes, which enabled him to send money back to his parents. He then went into research in tropical medicine, and in 1937 he traveled to East Africa as a part of that research. When the war began, he made an overland journey across Africa and down the Congo River to get a ship back to England, where he volunteered for military service. He was told, however, that he was more valuable in medical research. My mother was born in Dunfermline, Scotland, the third of 8 children of a family doctor. The eldest was a girl with Down syndrome who lived separately with a caregiver until she died at the age of 13. The family moved to South to Devon when my mother was 12. Like my father's family, hers was not well off. Nevertheless, they too managed to send their mother to Oxford. After Oxford, she had various jobs, including that of inspector of taxes, which she did not like. She gave that up to become a secretary, which was how she met my father in the early years of the war. I was born on January 8, 1942, exactly 300 years after the death of Galileo. I estimate, however, that about 200,000 other babies were also born that day. I don't know whether any of them was later interested in astronomy. I was born in Oxford, even though my parents were living in London. This was because during World War II, the Germans had an agreement that they would not bomb Oxford and Cambridge in return for the British not bombing Heidelberg and Göttingen. It is a pity that the civilized sort of arrangement couldn't have been extended to more cities. We lived in Highgate in North London. My sister Mary was born 18 months after me, and I am told I did not welcome her arrival. All through our childhood, there was a certain tension between us, fed by the narrow difference in our ages. In our adult life, however, this tension has disappeared, as we have gone different ways. She became a doctor, which pleased my father. My sister Philippa was born when I was nearly 5 and better able to understand what was happening. I can remember looking forward to her arrival so that there would be 3 of us to play games. She was a very intense and perceptive child, and I always respected her judgment and opinions. My brother, Edward, was adopted much later, when I was 14, so he hardly entered my childhood at all. He was very different from the other 3 children, being completely non-academic and non-intellectual, which was probably good for us. He was a rather difficult child, but one couldn't help liking him. He died in 2004 from a cause that was never properly determined. The most likely explanation is that he was poisoned by fumes from the glue he was using for renovations in his flat. My earliest memory is of standing in the nursery of Byron House School in Highgate and crying my head off. All around me, children were playing with what seemed like wonderful toys, and I wanted to join in, but I was only 2 and a half. This was the first time I had been left with people I didn't know, and I was scared. I think my parents were rather surprised at my reaction, because I was the first child and they had been following child development textbooks that say that children ought to be ready to start making social relationships at 2. But they took me away after that awful morning and didn't send me back to Byron House for another year and a half. At that time, during and just after the war, Highgate was an area in which a number of scientific and academic people lived. In another country, they would have been called intellectuals, but the English never admitted to having any intellectuals. All these parents sent their children to Byron House School, which was a very progressive school for those times. I remember complaining to my parents that the school wasn't teaching me anything. The educators at Byron House didn't believe in what was then the accepted way of drilling things into you. Instead, you were supposed to learn to read without realizing you were being taught. In the end, I did learn to read, but not until the fairly late age of 8. My sister Philippa was taught to read by more conventional methods and could read by the age of 4, but then she was definitely brighter than me. We lived in a tall, narrow Victorian house which my parent had bought very cheaply during the war when everyone thought London was going to be bombed flat. In fact, a V-2 rocket landed a few houses away from ours. I was away with my mother and sister at the time, but my father was in the house. Fortunately, he was not hurt, and the house was not badly damaged. But for years there was a large bomb site down the road on which I used to play with my friend Howard, who lived 3 doors the other way. Howard was a revelation to me because his parents weren't intellectuals like the parents of all other children I knew. He went to the council school, not Byron House, and he knew about football and boxing sports that my parents wouldn't have dreamed of following. Another early memory was getting my first train set. Toys were not manufactured during the war, at least not for the home market. But I had passionate interest in model trains. My father tried making me a wooden train, but that didn't satisfy me, as I wanted something that moved on its own. So he got a second-hand clockwork train, repaired it with a soldering iron, and gave it to me for Christmas when I was nearly 3. That train didn't work very well, but my father went to America just after the war, and when he came back to marry Queen, he brought my mother some nylons, which were not obtainable in Britain at that time. He brought my sister Mary a doll that closed its eyes when you laid it down, and he bought me an American train complete with cowcatcher and a figure 8 trap. I can still remember my excitement as I opened the box. Clockwork trains, which you had to wind up, were all very well, but what I really wanted were electric trains. I used to spend hours watching a model railway club layout in Crouch End near Highgate. I dreamed about electric trains. Finally, when both my parents were away somewhere, I took the opportunity to draw out of the post office bank all of the very modest amount of money that people had given me on special occasions, such as my christening. I used the money to buy an electric train set, but frustratingly enough, it didn't work very well either. I should have taken the set back and demanded the shop or manufacturer to replace it. But in those days, the attitude was that it was a privilege to buy something and it was just your bad luck if it turned out to be faulty. So, I paid for the electric motor of the engine to be serviced, but it never worked very well, even then. Later on, in my teens, I built model aeroplanes and boats. I was never very good with my hands, but I did this with my school friend John McLehan, who was much better and whose father had a workshop in their house. My aim was always to build working models that I could control. I didn't care what they looked like. I think it was the same drive that led me to invent a series of very complicated games with another school friend, Roger Farnhell. There were manufacturing games, complete with factories in which units of different colors were made, roads and railways on which they were carried, and a stock market. There were a war game played on a board of 4,000 squares and even a feudal game in which each player was a whole dynasty with a family tree. I think these games, as well as the trains, boats, and aeroplanes, came from an urge to know how systems worked and how to control them. Since I began my PhD, this need has made my research in cosmology. If you understand how the universe operates, you control it in a way. That ends chapter 1.